Well, hello, everyone, and welcome to yet another plenary of the COST EBRS project. It has been exciting to be with you, and I hope everybody is enjoying themselves. So today we are having a plenary with very interesting panelists between us. And it is a privilege and joy that everybody has accepted the invitation to participate in this panel. And I hope everybody will enjoy our session today. So I will start with introducing the three panelists that have kindly accepted to be with us today. So it is a privilege to host today Ms. Daeria Lawson. She's a PhD candidate in health research methodology at the Department of Health Research Methods, Evidence and Impact at the McMaster University. Her primary research focus is on the evaluation of methodological studies in health research. She's working with Dr. Mbuagbaw, who is also with us today, to develop the methodological study reporting checklist to help streamline the way that these studies are reported. She's also a trainee in the arthritis program at Toronto Western Hospital with research interests in trial design, methods for dealing with missing data, and patient education. And then we also have with us her mentor, Dr. Lawrence Mbuagbaw. He's a research methods consultant and clinical epidemiologist. He's an assistant professor in the Department of Health Research Methods, Evidence and Impact at McMaster University. His research interests are methodological research, HIV, mother and child health, mHealth, and health systems strengthening. He supports capacity building in health research methods, knowledge synthesis, and knowledge translation. And we also have today my very dear colleague and collaborator, Dr. Dawid Pieper. Dr. Pieper is the Deputy Director of the Institute for Research in Operative Medicine in Cologne, Germany, and his main research interests include health services research, methodological studies, and meta-research.
It is maybe my pleasure now, I'm the vice chair of this session, to introduce my dear colleague Livia Puljak, the chair of this session. She is the head of the Center of Evidence-Based Medicine and Healthcare at the Catholic University of Croatia in Zagreb. And she has helped actually to build Cochrane Croatia back in 2008 and has been affiliated with Cochrane ever since. And her research focus is on research methodology and evidence synthesis. And she will give the first talk of this session with the title, "What is meta-research and how should we call it?" So Livia, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you. So let me share my screen. So as Matthias kindly introduced my session, so I will talk briefly about what is meta-research and how should we call it. So currently we do not have a consensus definition of meta-research. When you read literature, you can find various definitions. For example, here you can see two definitions from papers of John Ioannidis. So in 2015, he wrote that meta-research is an evolving scientific discipline that aims to evaluate and improve research practices. It includes thematic areas of methods, reporting, reproducibility, evaluation, and incentives, how to do, report, verify, correct, and reward science. Then his most recent publication said meta-research is the study of research itself, its methods, reporting, reproducibility, evaluation, and incentives. Then, for example, the eLife journal says meta-research is research that uses the methods of science to study science itself, also known as meta-science or the science of science. It involves studying the processes and decisions that shape the evolution of scientific research, and so on and so on. So these definitions of individual researchers or sources, they are slightly variable, and they have different components that when I discuss about them with my colleagues, they disagree about some of these components, for example, whether studying incentives is indeed a meta-research or not. And we do not have a consensus terminology to describe the studies that we usually consider as meta-research or methodological studies. So when you read literature, you will find many terms such as meta-research study, methodological review, research on research study, systematic survey, meta-epidemiological study, etc., etc. And also many studies in this field that we can call meta-research do not use any design descriptors at all. So this has very practical implication that if we would like to search for such studies, we would have a very hard time creating a search strategy to find them because the nomenclature is so different and there are no indexing terms for these types of studies. And many of them are erroneously indexed as systematic reviews. And so when we consider all of these individual terms, we don't know whether they are synonyms, if they are different and how they are different, and whether do they mean the same thing to everyone. And very few studies have been conducted on this topic. So I'm really happy that we have an opportunity to discuss these topics today. So recently, in a study that was published by our panelists today, Daeria and Lawrence, they conducted a pilot study in which, among other things, they studied a terminology that was used in the studies that review methods. And you can see a figure from their published study and frequency of terms. So the most frequent terms that were used to report studies that review methods were meta-epidemiological study, systematic survey, systematic review, literature survey, and so on and so on. So they also found a great variability of this term. And then today we will also have an opportunity to discuss in more detail what is a meta-epidemiological study, one of the most common terms that is used in the studies that reviews methods. So this term is relatively recent. It first appeared in literature in 1997 in an editorial, and then in 2002, Stern et al. Published a methodological guidance for meta-epidemiological studies. But when you take a detailed look at the studies that have self-labeled themselves as meta-epidemiological or studies that define what is a meta-epidemiological study, you can also find a great variety of terms. In many of these studies, they do not use this approach, which was defined in 2002 by Stern and colleagues, but you have studies reporting methods that are using label meta-epidemiological study. So we have concluded that perhaps we should also have international consensus of colleagues from this field about what exactly is meta-epidemiological study. Is this now a term for any type of methodological study or still a very specific study design that corresponds to the description used by Stern and colleagues in 2002? So when we are at it, many of these studies are considered a systematic review, which is also up for discussion. But you know, the colleagues that I'm communicating with, they have a consensus that methodological studies are usually not systematic reviews, because in a systematic review, you have aim to synthesize evidence, while most of the meta-research studies do not synthesize evidence, and instead they analyze methods used in those studies. So together with our panelists today and our colleagues, Dawid Pieper and two other colleagues, we analyzed what is a systematic review, what the studies that were published are saying about this, and what are the most commonly used references. So we found many definitions that can be derived from the published literature and various elements of systematic review definitions, but very often the terms that are used to describe systematic reviews are very vague. For example, if you're using descriptors such as clear, explicit, and systematic, do we all mean the same when we say clear, explicit, and systematic without further elaboration? So this is also another field of research that would be very interesting to be developed further and to create a consensus definition of a systematic review. So these inconsistencies that we are having regarding terminology, regarding definitions, what is a meta-research, what type of research is this? So this is currently confusing, and so the part of the problem is that these terms are very recent. So we are talking about last 20 years or so that we are having these new terms. So I'm very happy to see multiple colleagues who are very interested in working on these definitions and terminology, and create some consensus definitions and terminology. So I would like to highlight the words of Daeria and Lawson from their published pilot study, where they wrote that nomenclature is an issue that must be addressed, and this is especially true with the use of labels such as systematic review, which is attributed to a specific well-defined form of evidence synthesis for healthcare, or in the case of some studies which have used the term methodologic, which is not otherwise defined in English dictionaries, and which could comprise their detection in searches. To summarize these inconsistencies that we have in the nomenclature and definitions, they're hindering searching and further research. So we would all, as a research community, benefit from uniform labeling of these types of studies. So this would also help in enabling search strategies when somebody would like to search the methodological studies themselves. And I'm very happy that Lawson and Daeria are spearheading the project, the methodological review reporting checklist development metric, because I think their project will be highly relevant and will contribute immensely to this field of interest. So I would like to thank you for your attention, and I'm looking very much forward to further presentations from this panel. So the next presentation will be presentation by Dr. Dawid Pieper, who will provide a bit more details about what is a meta-epidemiological study. David, please.
Hi, this is Dawid Pieper from Witten-Herdecke University, Germany. I'm very happy to be able to take part in the first evidence-based research conference on increasing the value of research. The last speaker, Livia Puljak, tried to answer the question, what is meta-research and how we should call it. In my presentation, I will try to follow up on this and try to answer the question, what is a meta-epidemiological study? I do not have any potential conflicts of interest related to this presentation. First of all, I would like to give you an impression of how frequent the term meta-epidemiology or meta-epidemiological studies is. So I searched PubMed in the end of October 2020, applying the search string you can find at the bottom of the slide, and what you can see here is simply the number of publications per year. Please note that this is not the cumulative number of publications, but the absolute number of articles published each year. And looking at that, it becomes clear that there's a huge increase in the last 5 years on studies using the term meta-epidemiology or meta-epidemiological in its title. When looking at the literature, I believe it is sensible to divide it into two groups. The first group is what I would consider to be the traditional meta-epidemiological study. The second group consists of articles that do not use the term meta-epidemiology appropriately. In the following, I will try to explain to you what is a traditional meta-epidemiological study, and in the second part of my presentation I will show you some examples what is not a meta-epidemiological study, but I will also try to explain why this term might be used for that. To the best of my knowledge, this is the first published meta-epidemiological study. If you recall the figure of publication years, you might remember that according to the figure, the first meta-epidemiological study was published in 1997. This can be explained by the fact that this study, published in JAMA in 1995, does not use the term meta-epidemiological, but is described to be an observational study in the abstract. The main result of the study can be seen on the right side. In simple words, the study investigates the impact of study characteristics on treatment estimates in randomized controlled trials. The study characteristic investigated here first is allocation concealment. The ratio of odds ratios is 0.7 for randomized controlled trials with an unclear allocation concealment compared to studies with an adequate allocation concealment. As also indicated by the p-value, it shows that there's a difference between trials with an unclear and an adequate allocation concealment. The result of 0.7 needs to be interpreted in a way that studies with an unclear allocation concealment result in 30% higher treatment effects. How to get such interesting results? You will need a large collection of meta-analysis first. Next, you need to obtain data for the study characteristics of your interest from already included trials, which can be very bothersome, of course. There might be many study characteristics you could think of. You might be interested to compare industry-funded to non-industry funded studies, or you might also be interested in comparing studies by origin, for example. In order not to be lost in statistical details, I would only like to mention that there is a two-step approach. First, you need to calculate a ratio of odds ratios within each meta-analysis. Then, in the second step, you summarize all obtained ratios of odds ratios into one meta-analysis. I hope you have now an idea of how it works. However, I guess more important to know is that the results from such meta-epidemiological studies are very relevant. They have been conducted for several types of bias, as you can see here on the right side. When reading through them, you might realize that you are already very familiar with these types of bias if you have ever applied the cognitive of bias tool to assess the risk of bias in randomized controlled trials. So, if this was a traditional meta-epidemiological study, what other studies safe claiming to be meta-epidemiological are out there? We were very interested in that and tried to investigate this. Our results have been published some months ago, and I will report some results of it for the case you did not come across the study yet. In this study, we analyzed descriptors and definitions of meta-epidemiological studies, as well as study designs of articles that were self-described as meta-epidemiological studies. We searched Medline and Embase in 2019 and extracted definitions of meta-epidemiological studies, as well as study designs, statistics, and units of analysis that were reported in studies safe-labeled as meta-epidemiological studies. In total, 175 information sources were included in the analysis. First, let us have a look at some definitions and quotes collected from our information sources. The first one, that is highlighted in green, research that examines the influence of trial or study characteristics on effect estimates, makes me really happy, as this is in line with what I consider to be the traditional meta-epidemiological study. All other quotes can be considered to be at least doubtful. Evaluation of the frequency of use of different instruments in the published trial literature. Interesting. Meta-epidemiological studies are the cornerstone of meta-research. I'm not sure about that. A meta-epidemiological study is a specialized umbrella review that synthesizes the meta-analysis of systematic reviews. Seems to be a completely different topic for me. And the same is also true for the next one. Study typically appraising systematic reviews without explicitly aiming at informing on a specific clinical condition or topic. While the last quote implicates that meta-epidemiological research is the same as a methodological survey. The study we conduct is a methodological survey, also called meta-epidemiological research. Here you can see some snapshots of descriptors we found in our study. You see, this is not only about meta-epidemiological studies, but many more. There's nothing that does not exist. Meta-epidemiological review, meta-epidemiological survey, analysis, approach, assessment, evaluation. You could merely take what you like best. So it seems to be obvious that there's a problem with the term meta-epidemiology. However, it is not our intention to blame the authors for this, but we are interested in explaining this and try to develop solutions. In order to try to explain the potential misuse of meta-epidemiology, I would like to share two examples with you. One is from Livia Puljak, while the other example is from my own work. So, the first study by Engelking investigates the use of systematic reviews for justifying a new trial in the field of anesthesiology, and it is called to be a meta-epidemiological study. First of all, let us focus on the content of the article. Justification of new trials should always be informed by using systematic reviews. This is a core concept of evidence-based research. Unfortunately, there are not many comparable investigations out there. More work is definitely welcome in this area. So, while being definitely important, is this a meta-epidemiological study? When you think of the traditional way I have introduced to you some minutes ago? It does not investigate any characteristics and does not deal with effect estimates. So, when keeping the traditional meta-epidemiological study in mind, you would need to declare that this is not a meta-epidemiological study. While in the first example the term meta-epidemiological is used in the title, it is not in the second study on quality ratings of reviews and overviews I have authored some years ago. But what is interesting about it is that upon submission we declared this to be a meta-epidemiological study indeed. The title was challenged upon acceptance by the editor, who also followed the idea of the traditional meta-epidemiological study. I would like to be self-critical here, and I admit that I believe that it was not appropriate to name our study to be a meta-epidemiological one. I will come back to this point and provide a potential explanation in a few minutes. Let us have a short look what we have learned so far. First, I think it has become obvious that there seems to be something wrong in the literature with the term meta-epidemiology. It is used quite differently and seems to lack a standardized understanding and lacks a definition. What can also be observed is that the term is nowadays also used for methodological studies. Nevertheless, there is something that I would like to call the traditional meta-epidemiological study, being a study investigating the association of study characteristics with effect estimates. So this is how we can describe the problem. And now we need to ask, why is this the case? First of all, I would like to mention that I do not think that there's a simple and clear answer to this. I rather think that the problem should be looked at from several sides. In general, I think it is desirable to state the study design in the title or in the abstract. This is informative and facilitates the identification of the article. Please note that this might also have implications for the reporting of such an article, as many journals ask you to follow a reporting guideline and already plenty of them exist. Reporting guidelines themselves also often ask for stating the study design in the title. So one potential explanation might be the fact that there has been simply a shift towards reporting the study design in the title or abstract over the last decades. I suspect that most of you will agree that this can be appreciated in general. However, this issue with methodological studies might be different from clinical studies or from all health-related studies where the object of interest is a person. Methodological study is not a study design, but a, let's say, category or topic. I'm really not sure how to call it. If this is still difficult to understand, try to answer the question whether you can imagine a study that is both a methodological study, and an RCT at the same time. Consider, for example, a study that compares blinded peer review versus non-blinded peer review by randomizing peer reviewers. For study design, it is a randomized trial, while at the same time it is also a methodological study. Therefore, it would be interesting to know whether authors of such studies use the consort statement for reporting the study and whether the consort statement will be fully applicable to a methodological study. I know that some work in this area is already underway. Are there any other alternatives you can think of? I guess it is not easy. Taking the evidence-based research approach, we should think of how to name studies relevant for EBR. This would be definitely very helpful. I know that the study team led by Hans Lund spent a lot of time identifying these studies. At the end of my presentation, I would like to conclude that having definitions is always a good idea. Nevertheless, as in many other areas, it is important to find consensus on it. I believe there has been a lot of improvement in clinical areas over the last decades. No one really took care about studies more focused on methods. The term meta-epidemiology was just one example how using a term can change over time, and I believe this term has been taken up by many author groups given that there's a paucity of alternatives and lack of consensus. A lot of work is ahead of us. Thank you for your attention, and I'm looking forward to the next two speakers, Daeria and Lawson. Maybe they're already working on some solutions.
Many thanks to Dr. Dawid Pieper for his insightful presentation and for raising many relevant questions. I find myself personally very often on the receiving end of the comments of peer reviewers and editors that I personally disagree with regarding all these methodological aspects. Well, this week, the few days ago, I was emailing with Dawid Pieper because a journal in which we often submit papers to, they requested a PRISMA checklist for a study that I would call methodological study. So I tried to argue with the editorial staff in multiple emails that this was not a systematic review, and therefore a PRISMA checklist was not applicable. But it was a complete waste of time. They were literally only repeating, please submit PRISMA checklist. Unless you submit PRISMA checklist, we cannot proceed with the evaluation of your manuscript, and so on and so on. So I finally gave in and I submitted the PRISMA checklist, but I wrote in the manuscript that I do not think it's applicable. So this is also something that we can discuss later on when our panel discussion will start. So thanks again very much to Dr. Dawid Pieper for his insights and his presentation. And now it's a pleasure and privilege to announce the presentation of Dr. Mbuagbaw and Ms. Daeria Lawson on the METRIC project. Very exciting development. So please, Daeria and Lawrence, the floor is yours.
Hello, we are honored to be here and would like to thank the organizers for the invitation to speak at the first EBR conference. It is a pleasure to be here with you all virtually. Today we'll be presenting an overview of our research to develop a reporting checklist for methodological studies. These are our disclosures. Previous speakers have gone over some definitions for meta-research and meta-epidemiological studies. In line with these definitions, we also provide an interpretation of methodological studies as relevant to our work. We define methodological studies as studies that describe or evaluate the design, conduct, analysis, or reporting of health research literature. Their common unit of analysis is research reports, such as study abstracts, final reports of studies and reviews, trial registry records, study protocols, and so on. Methodological studies are very useful and are the cornerstone of high-quality research. They help to identify inappropriate methods and propose solutions. They often serve as precursors to the development of new reporting guidelines. For example, the development of CONSORT was based on methodological research, which highlighted that clinical trials were inadequately designed and reported, which was associated with biased estimates of treatment effects. Methodological studies also provide evidence for better research practices. Some examples of these widely adopted practices include double data extraction in systematic reviews and performing credible subgroup analysis. They have also spurred the development of prospective registries such as clinicaltrials.gov. Methodological research highlighted the number of trials that remained unpublished after 10 years. Similarly, Prospero was established to help reduce unnecessary duplication of research. As such, methodological studies help to reduce research waste in many ways. There are many types of methodological studies. There are studies that evaluate reporting practices and trends of reporting over time. Other studies investigate spin and biases in research. Others investigate the impact of study design factors on study outcomes and results. And there are studies that evaluate differences in approaches to analyzing data and how this might impact study results. This is a very small snapshot of the types of methodological studies that have been published. There are many other variants. As a starting point, we have developed a conceptual framework for some key features of methodological studies that can be used to classify them. For example, methodological studies may be classified based on the aim, which could be to investigate bias, reporting, methods, nomenclature, or to summarize other methodological studies. They can also be classified based on their design, the sampling strategy used, or the unit of analysis. There are many names for methodological studies, and our list keeps growing. As an example, in just one subset of methodological studies, the Cochrane Methodological Reviews, we found 11 different names in a sample of 32 studies. Authors also use different names interchangeably, and more than 3/4 of these studies referred to their own study with at least 2 different names in the title, abstract, or elsewhere in the report. As a first step towards mapping the landscape of methodological studies, we carried out a pilot study to determine if it is feasible to search for and identify methodological studies in the literature. We focused on studies published in PubMed and restricted our search to 1 year based on some common terms attributed to these studies. For example, meta-epidemiological study. We included 31 eligible studies, which had 12 different names, and based on this sample, we found that searching for these studies is difficult but not impossible. We found that we could refine our strategy and it could be applied to more databases for a larger investigation. We also found that reporting styles and completeness of reporting between the included methodological studies was inconsistent. This pilot study has shed light on a number of knowledge gaps with regards to the current state of methodological studies. First, there is no formal guidance for reporting these studies, and this inherently leads to inconsistencies in reporting between studies. We agree with many other researchers that concise, user-friendly, evidence-informed, and consensus-based guidance is needed to ensure that methodological studies are transparent. Secondly, to our knowledge, these studies have not been systematically studied, and so their diversity and scope is poorly understood. This further hampers the development of appropriate nomenclature and appropriate indexing in literature databases. Lastly, the lack of a preferred nomenclature and the lack of a searchable database for methodological studies makes it challenging to identify and use them. This also compromises end users' ability to search for, identify, and use these important studies. Now, Daeria will take over to describe our project and how we are working to address these issues. Thank you.
Thank you, Lawrence. And so in light of these knowledge gaps with respect to methodological studies, the primary aim of our project is to promote optimal reporting of these studies. And we hope to achieve this by first conducting a comprehensive and systematic review of the literature to summarize the evidence on methodological studies. And this will help us to outline their various designs, analysis, and reporting features, as well as identify and prioritize aspects in need of guidance, and identify candidate reporting items for the guideline. In addition, we will identify methodological study experts from the list of authors of the included studies who can contribute to the guideline development process. We will then create an open access living database where we will index the methodological studies from our review and also keep this resource up to date going forward. And lastly, we will develop reporting guidelines such that they can appropriately address the nuances of the different subtypes of methodological studies. Based on our pilot work, we have developed a relatively broad search strategy to capture methodological studies. And we applied this strategy to 5 major databases in addition to searching several gray literature sources such as the SWOT-SWAR database. Currently, we are at the full-text screening stage, and since our search was broad, there is quite a bit of noise that we have had to screen through. For example, screening for methodological studies that have been called systematic reviews. And it is, of course, inevitable that we will miss some studies, but nevertheless, we believe that this will be the most comprehensive review to date of this particular body of literature. So far, we have found that there really is no single dedicated space for methodological studies. However, there are a number of more focused databases out there that index methodological research, while some have ceased to be updated. So, for example, the Cochrane Methodology Register, which tracked methodological studies relevant to systematic review methods, has been discontinued for some time as of 2012. And in our searches and pilot work, we also found that there were no established subject headings for methodological studies, with very few exceptions. CINAHL, for example, has one for research methodology. And so we have developed a website for an open access database where we will catalog all of the included studies from our review. We have incorporated some standard searching features, which we will fine-tune as we begin to categorize and develop a taxonomy for methodological studies. And with funding, we plan to keep this resource up to date. And in future, we also will conduct user testing to collect feedback to ensure that it is in fact useful and functional for researchers and end users of methodological studies. The final stage of this work culminates with the development of the reporting guideline or checklist. And we will conduct an online consensus exercise with experts, so methodological study authors who are most active in this area, to come to a consensus about the categories or types of methodological studies, the appropriate name or names for methodological studies, and lastly, the candidate reporting items for these studies. We will then conduct several meetings to go over the results of the consensus exercise, and we will confirm the appropriate names and categories, as well as discuss rationales for these. And through these discussions, we will draft a reporting checklist and accompanying user guide. During these meetings, we'll also be confirming the best structure for the checklist. And lastly, we will confirm rationales and examples for each reporting item to arrive at the final checklist, our consensus statement, and an elaborated user guide. Again, we're currently at the review stage of this project and are aiming to complete this before the end of the year. We are completing this work simultaneously alongside various knowledge translation activities, such that the guideline development process will lead to the development of a tool that will be used and endorsed. And we have recruited a number of stakeholders for this purpose, including editors of the journals pictured here, as well as participants for the consensus study. And our aim is to complete and disseminate the final reporting guideline, hopefully by next year, as well as encourage user feedback for the database. And lastly, we want to thank these individuals for their time, expertise, ongoing support, and commitment to this project. This has truly been a collaborative effort, and although there is still a lot to do ahead, this work would not have been possible without their support. Thank you.
Great, many thanks to Daeria and Lawrence for their plenary presentation. So now we are opening the floor to the questions. And we have received multiple questions already. So we will start with those, and we will also try to engage you with, responding to the discussion and asking more questions. And I hope all panelists can chip in the discussion. So I will start with the first question we got, and the question was, should evidence-based research also be up there? Are we part of meta-research taxonomy? So there were two comments, one from Karen Robinson, who posted a reply. This may be provocative, but I argue in my talk later today that EBR should not be conflated with meta-research. And Hans Lund wrote, EBR is using meta-research, depends upon meta-research, but is not meta-research as I see it. So for me, my personal view would be that evidence-based research is a broader concept, and that the terms that we are working on, that we are trying to find a consensus on, should be something that will define the type of study that is conducted. So what I'm hoping is that one day we can come up with a term that everybody will be, have a common understanding of what it means. Just like, when you read in the title that the study is randomized controlled trial. So ideally, one day I would like to see something equivalent for the types of studies that we are talking about today. But, maybe I'm too idealistic. Let's see what the other panelists thinks. David, do you have any opinion on this?
Yeah, I fully agree with you, Livia. I mean, I think we're only at the beginning of a very, very long journey. I mean, there are that many concepts, meta-research, research on research methodological studies, and I really think if we would start a vote now or ask for definitions, who's going to define what, I think it would be really a mess. And I think even for us who are conducting methodological studies or studies on research, it is really difficult to come up with a good solution. And yeah, a lot of work is ahead of us.
Thank you. Lawrence, maybe a word about this?
Thanks, Livia. In line with what David presented, I think the way forward will ultimately be to go back to look at how the terms were originally intended to be used. Because the first person who coined meta-epidemiology meant something. And then you have the other studies which are doing something more or less similar, and they call it a survey. So we need to go back to exactly what a survey means, what a systematic review means, and what meta-epidemiological study means, and we try to tease those things apart. So we're hoping that with the work I'm doing with Daeria, we could come to some sort of consensus about some of these things.
Thank you. So Daeria, maybe you have any opinion on this issue?
Yeah, I agree with Lawrence. And although I think it is ideal to have one term, I'm not sure how achievable that will be, just having seen the diversity of these studies. So I think that's why it'll be also important to look at the categories and really develop a taxonomy for these studies, because there really are different branches. So I'm not sure that it's achievable in anytime soon.
Yeah, it's definitely not an easy task. So there was a second question for me. The question was, I will copy it to everyone so that everyone can see it in the chat. Maybe that will be easier. So the question was, what do you think of Fiona Fiedler's definition of meta-research, the study of research norms, practices, and cultures for the purpose of intervening and improving research itself? So I find this definition very appealing. I think the definition talks about what you would like to study, the research norms, practices, and cultures, and the ultimate aim is I like the ultimate aim, the purpose of intervening and improving research itself. I think this is the basic aim of all the studies that we do. Everything that we call meta research is to find recommendations about what can we do about research in the future, what can we do better, how can we improve research. So regarding the first part, the study of research norms, practices, and cultures, I think the first part is very wide. And I'm not sure whether the first part, research norms, practices, and cultures, is covering everything that I would personally consider meta research. For example, the study of cultures. I'm not sure, because the word culture is also very, very wide. Just when you say methods, the word culture can also be very, very different to different people. So maybe we can now start from Daria. If you have any opinion about the Fiona Fiedler's definition of meta research.
Yeah, it's very broad, and I'm also a little unsure about the cultures specifically, but we've kind of adopted for our purposes the definition of these studies as encompassing the design, reporting practices, analysis approaches, and that's kind of been the definition that we've kind of led with, but research norms make sense to me as well in terms of, how different groups might approach looking at the methods and different types of study designs. And of course, it overall encompasses practices, practices of conducting health research. So I think it's a broad definition, but it can work.
Thank you. Lawrence, any feedback on this?
Thanks, Livia. I think that's a great definition. It's very broad and encompassing, but most of what we have been discussing here is a very small subset of that. And for the purposes of developing guidelines, I can see how guidelines for studies reporting on research practices could be similar, but as soon as you go into reporting research norms, research cultures, and then those require different kinds of research, maybe even qualitative research. So ultimately the guidelines for that kind of research would be very different. But I do agree that everything we are doing has the ultimate aim, as in this definition, of trying to improve research itself.
Thank you. David?
Yeah, I mean, from my personal point of view, I like the definition, but I don't think it will work as a working definition. I mean, you could, when reading this definition, you could also ask about the definition of what is a research norm, what does research culture imply, what does it really mean? So in particular, when thinking of Daeria's and Lawrence project, and it comes down to decide whether a study should be included or should not be included, whether it is meta research or not, I think we are really in need of a more concrete definition.
Thank you. So we had another question for me that said, so I will copy it so everyone can see it. So the question is, how do you personally keep up to date with all the meta research that is published? For example, do you work with core journals that you screen, or a complex search string that you run weekly or monthly? So unfortunately, no. I cannot really say that I'm keeping up well with all the meta research that is published. I'm trying to personally to follow a few key journals that I'm interested in and that publish the research from my personal lines of interest. And I have personally never tried to create a search strategy of studies that something comparable to what the metric project is achieving, because my experience is that many of these studies use very heterogeneous study design descriptors, and also many of them do not use any descriptors at all. So in my studies that I've been conducting with my colleagues, we have been focused on very specific study designs. So for example, when Dawid and I conducted this study on meta-epidemiological studies, we were searching for that term specifically, not for any other terms. Or, for example, if I was searching for systematic reviews from a certain field, or randomized controlled trials from a certain field, those searches were easy because you have indexing terms for systematic reviews or for randomized controlled trials. But I have faced this problem first time when we were discussing another project regarding applicability of existing reporting checklist for methodological studies, and when we started discussing the search strategy, and that turned out to be really a mess. That you can't really create a very good strategy using the current terms, because many studies do not use any labeling terms at all. So maybe Dawid, you have feedback on this from your personal perspective?
Yeah, I think this is yes. So personally, I even do not try to keep up with these studies. I mean, nobody is able to come up with a number of how many meta research or research on research studies, or however to call them, are out there. So I mean, you are only able to follow very, very specific and very concrete fields where you are interested in. And I mean, in this perspective, I tried for a long time not to use it, but after several months of using Twitter, I must admit that it is really helpful in order to keep up to date with studies that you are interested in.
Thank you. Maybe Lawrence, do you have any feedback on this? Do you have any regular searches, or you search for target journals?
I would say Daeria will be the best person to speak to this, because she's the one actually doing the searches. But based on our pilot, we found some very interesting things. Of all the number of terms that were used, when you use the term and you get the articles, we actually checked to see which of those articles were actually methodological studies. So there were 4 terms that were the most that had the most hits. There was meta-epidemiological, systematic survey, systematic review, and literature survey. And we can't really pin down any specific journal in which these studies are reported, because they appear in all sorts of journals, in clinical specialties, in systematic review journals, in research methods journals. So there's really no core set of journals that you can use. That's why it's so important for us to get that database.
Thank you. Daeria, any comments? As we heard that you have the principal burden here on searching.
It was very challenging. We worked with 2 librarians to kind of develop the search strategy, but even then it was all keyword searching. It was very broad. Ever since our pilot, we've kind of maintained our own nomenclature library, so to say, to kind of keep track of some of the terms that we're coming across. But also social media has been helpful, like following, like yourself, following journals like Journal of Clinical Epidemiology and BMC research methods, journals that publish a lot of these types of studies, especially for those that don't have any study design in the name. It's, when in instances where the title is just kind of stating the results. Twitter, yeah, but I've set up some Google alerts as well for those key terms, but it's been a challenge. Yeah.
Thank you. So then there was a question that I'm copying in chat for everyone that was aimed for Dawid and me, and that said, what would be a meta-analysis that you found in your study on descriptors of meta-epidemiological studies? So yeah, it was an interesting term. So I will copy the study where, the resource actually, where this, it's a book called Modern Meta-Analysis. And here comes the actual, so I'm copying to chat for everyone, the actual description of this. A meta-analysis is a meta-analysis of multiple meta-analysis. Yeah, so this reminds me of overviews of systematic reviews when I have to explain to my students, what is an overview of systematic review? So it's a systematic review of systematic reviews. So this meta-analysis reminds me of that. Yes, so here you can see the definition that the authors have used. So this is not up for, for debate of what they wrote, but we're just presenting what these authors have presented. So then there was a question for Lawrence and Daeria, and the question said, what is meta-research of meta-research called? Now we're getting to this, the same level of complexity as meta-analysis of meta-analysis. What is the meta-research of meta-research called? Maybe overviews of meta-research, huh?
Thanks, Livia. I think if we agree that meta-research is research, then meta-research of meta-research will still be meta-research, right? It's asking how to call the parent of a parent of a parent of a parent. You're still a parent.
Yeah, and I think at this point, we're just calling them methodological studies. It seems to be the most encompassing term for us at the point.
So thank you. Then there was here I'm copying a question for David and me. So when investigating meta research, are you restricting your searches to health research? If that's not the case, what are the fundamental differences you found across disciplines, if any, both in terms of definitions and methods? So I can speak for myself personally. I have never studied anything outside of the health research field. I don't know about Dawid, maybe.
Yeah, I think this is a great question. Yeah, I mean, when we are conducting such studies, we typically restrict to databases such as PubMed, and I mean, as a result of this, only biomedical literature can be considered in this studies. Nevertheless, I admit that it might be interesting to include other studies as well. What is the reason why this is not done? I mean, I think one of the reasons is definitely resources. I think we did not already tackle the issue that many of this research is not well funded or not funded at all. So we somehow need to find a way to still conduct a study and to have a result, a useful result at the end of the day with limited resources. So this is one reason for the restriction, but another reason why it could make sense to restrict your searches is to, when it comes down to publish the results of such a study, you will have to decide to what journal you are going to submit such research. And if you would not if you would search without any restrictions and search for studies in all scientific disciplines, the question would be, okay, where are you going to submit this research? And I think this could be challenging. So I guess it's a simple choice to stick with the biomedical literature. Sometimes you could also include psychological journals as well, probably. And then you have a clear aim, and you have your journals where you can submit your research findings. We cannot hear you.
So we had a question for everyone that said, how should knowledge gained from methodological studies be best presented and summarized for clinical researchers who are not so methodologically versed but would still like to use up-to-date research methods? So I think this is a great question, because this is basically what the impact of these studies should be. The people who are conducting the studies being investigated, that they do something better in the future. So I think the impact should not only be targeted towards clinical researchers, but also everyone who is conducting any type of research. So for example, many of the studies that I've done with colleagues have been devoted to the adequacy of risk of bias assessment in systematic reviews. So the messages that our studies have brought are applicable to authors of systematic reviews, regarding of whether they are clinical researchers or not. How to make this impact? So some ideas are that this should be integrated in the educational curricula, that this should be integrated in instructions for conducting research, that these messages gained from methodological studies should be perhaps also something that the ethics review boards are also incorporating in their analysis, because many studies have to go through ethics review, and for example, if you have clinical trials that go to ethics review, but they do not have some crucial components, they could be targeted by ethical review boards, and the authors could be asked to change something. Then also what I have seen is that some interventions in the registries can be something to be considered. So, for example, if the authors are filling in some forms in the registries that are freely available online, and that publish protocols of studies, then some prompts towards authors can motivate authors to make some changes in their design and to consider some things that they didn't think of before. The interventions on the level of editors and peer reviewers would also be very welcome, because editors and peer reviewers get to review some information. But the one of the problems with targeting the final product is that maybe you cannot change anything. If you have a study like systematic review, and if editors and peer reviewers tell you to change something, you could go back and change something. But if you have a clinical study and you have completed your study on patients, then you can go back in time and change something. So there are, the way I see it, some crucial differences definitely between different types of studies that can be targeted with interventions. What are your views on this, Lawrence? So Lawrence, do you have any comments on this?
Thanks, Livia. I've had the experience of having to review a systematic review about 10 years ago, conducted by a single author. And I responded to the editor saying this systematic review the data has been extracted by one person, and this is problematic. And the author got back to me saying, Well, I did it alone and I did it well. So it was up to me to find the evidence that double data extraction is linked to less errors. And that was my first experience with why it is important for us to collect this information on the practices that are best for research. And I think for clinicians and knowledge users, there are many easy ways to distill the information from methodological studies. For example, Prisma clearly states double data extraction because there's evidence for that, right? So we need to encourage them to use reporting guidelines because these guidelines are based on evidence generated from methodological studies. And there are other sorts of studies that would generate information like, well, trials in surgery do not use the consort statement, for example. And then this leads us to two things. Either we need to educate surgeons, or maybe the consort statement is not fit for surgical trials. And that opens new avenues for them to say, well, we think we want to do our research in a robust way, but these guidelines don't fit. That's why we don't use them. So there are more avenues for them to explore that. But I think ultimately we need to be able to communicate the information in concise ways to the other knowledge users who might be interested.
Thank you, Lawrence. So we have a question for Lawrence and Daeria now. I've copied the question into the chat. So the question is, once you've established the metric database, will users' suggestions be welcomed for the addition of more literature to the database?
I'll go first. That is the plan, because we recognize that we cannot find everything on our own. And we think that it is the users who can say, hey, I published a methodological review, it's not in your database. Can you add it? Please send us the reference and we'll add it. We will have to crowdsource to completely populate this database. That's part of our plan.
Right, and also from discussions from our consensus exercises, we're hoping to also determine whether researchers think that it's also helpful to register or submit protocols as well, and have this space as a registry for future research. So I think it will be important for sure.
Well, thank you, Lawrence and Daeria. So now we got a question for all panelists. I copied it in the chat that says, do you see a problem with recognizing meta-research as a research, for example, for a PhD? So I will start, with my personal experiences. So I have multiple PhD students who are conducting these types of studies, and I see a lot of problems by colleagues who are doing other types of research. For example, they do animal research or research on humans, and many of them do not recognize this as a real research or as a medicine at all. So I keep having discussions with people who consider this like totally inferior field of activity and not a real research. And sometimes this has implications on obstruction of these PhD thesis projects. So that's my personal experience, but I don't know if that can be generalized to other settings. Several years ago, Professor Damir Sapunar and I conducted one study among the directors of European PhD programs, and we asked them whether so we started with a systematic review. So we asked them whether a systematic review can be recognized as a legitimate part of a PhD thesis, or can PhD thesis rely completely on one or more systematic reviews. So around half of them said, no, this cannot be a PhD thesis or part of the PhD thesis. So my personal feeling is that there is a lot of opposition on the idea that this is actually research or at all, or medicine at all. So let's see, maybe from Daeria. Daeria is a PhD student. So any opinion from Daeria on this? Did you have any problems? Do you see this at McMaster, or McMaster is much more advanced in this respect as a home of the term evidence-based medicine, huh?
Yeah, I mean, I'm still here, I'm still doing my PhD, and my committee seems to be approving so far. So I haven't personally faced any problems in that regard. And our program is very much rooted in methods research. So there are many PhD students who are working in this realm and successfully defending theses. And so I haven't fortunately experienced any barriers.
I have a better experience on this. I mean, it's many years ago, but when I submitted my PhD thesis, was on overviews, reviews on reviews. The comment by the professor responsible for the PhD program was, well, this could be accepted this time, but you did not collect any data in your research. And so I emailed him. So, what is the problem here? And the example I chose for him is, I mean, I've searched for overviews and I extracted all the data from them and came up with a complete new analysis. And so if he says that I did not collect any data, I told him that I do not really see the reason. If someone is going to use a registry with clinical data in it, and he's going only to analyze the data, he's not going collecting new data at all. He takes data already collected and goes to analyze them. Okay. Unfortunately, I never received an answer to my email. Yeah. And I saw in the chat that someone came up with the question whether meta-research is original research, and I guess this is a very interesting point, and it would also be great to find consensus on them. What is original research? I mean, it's not only about whether meta-research is original research. We also have already to find whether a systematic review constitutes original research or whether it is only a review. And my overall impression is that it is improving, but it takes time. And I really believe that countries such as Canada, for example, might be ahead of other countries here.
Thank you, David. Yes, so David and I have published a study in which we analyze some of these considerations and questions. And one of my studies explored this issue of whether a systematic review is original study or not. And we conducted the study among biomedical journal editors. And the majority of them considered this an original research, but some of them also said, so who cares, basically who cares, if we call it original or non-original research. Systematic reviews are useful, so do we really need to bother with defining them as original research or not? But one practical problem that I'm facing in the institutions where I used to work and where I'm working is that, for example, for academic advancement or for a PhD thesis topic, the bylaws say that you need to publish original research, so if you are aiming for an academic advancement in an institution that requires you to do original research, then the question of whether a systematic review or a methodological study is original research or not becomes an obstacle for your academic advancement. If somebody tells you, oh, this is not original research, so you cannot base your academic advancement or your PhD thesis topic on this. So then this can have practical implications if somebody wants you to do original research, and it is debated whether this is original research or not. So we got a question for Lawrence and Daeria that said, do you consider the quality risk of bias in meta-research?
Thanks. That's an excellent question, and it's something that we considered and actually discussed in the paper we wrote, a tutorial on methodological studies. So we realized that a lot of methodological studies copied over practices from systematic reviews. And assessing risk of bias is one of them. It's just something people do because we have a collection of studies, we assess the risk of bias. But the reason why we assess risk of bias is to see if how much certainty we can trust in the estimate of effect we are seeing from this meta-analysis. But if there is no estimate of effect, and then there is no need to measure risk of bias in the first place. For many methodological studies, risk of bias on its own is not useful to the estimate you're trying to determine. If you want to see how complete studies are, the studies can be reported completely. For example, they will say they didn't blind, they say they didn't conceal allocation, they would say they selected certain outcomes and reported them. The study will be completely well reported, right? But it will have very high risk of bias. So those are two separate things. And most of the time, methodological studies are interested in the latter. They want to see what's the quality of reporting, how people report, and all of that. On the other hand, there are certain items of risk of bias which constitute methodological questions. For example, you could look at what study features are associated with, say, centralized randomization, for example. Since centralized randomization requires a certain amount of resources and probably a statistician and all of that. So that would be a separate research question, which would require that you collect information on random sequence generation. But not necessarily risk of bias in methodological studies. So we don't have the numbers right now, but I think it's close to 50% of the methodological studies we've been working with assessed risk of bias. Thanks.
Daeria, any words on this, or?
I don't have much to add, and I don't know if maybe I understood the question differently, whether we are assessing risk of bias in the studies that we are including. And yeah, just to add on, the aim of our project is more to assess the completeness in reporting. So risk of bias necessarily, and since there is no guidance for the conduct of these studies, and we've seen that researchers take very different approaches to conducting meta-research, then it's not particularly relevant for our purposes.
Thank you. Then we are going back to the question for all panelists that says, okay, I will copy it to everyone. I understand the need to think about and discuss these terminology issues. However, regarding evidence-based research, EBR, isn't the aim to eventually abandon this term again someday, hoping that all research will be or expected to be evidence-based, so that we will be back to just talking about the research. Yeah, so I think this is very idealistic, and I truly hope that one day we will get to this, that every single piece of research will indeed be evidence-based in a sense that we are talking about in this project. So I think it's very idealistic. And I see the comment from Robin and Hans that say, you know, what a wonderful world, and I have a dream. So indeed, I think it is a wonderful dream, and I hope we will see one day that day. But let's see if maybe Dawid has any comments on that.
Yeah, I mean, this would be great. However, I doubt that I will be able to see this in my life, given the life expectancy. And I mean, even if it would improve, even if it would heavily improve and say it would be nearly perfect, I think that some sort of monitoring it is always a good a good idea. I mean, this somehow comes back to a question we had in the session before. I mean, if you imagine that you would start a study to monitor the evidence-based research approach across publications, and you would be very confident at the beginning of your study that it is 100% that the world is really perfect. I think then we should still go with the study and say, okay, it is perfect. No improvement is needed. That would still be a great result.
Thank you, David. So maybe any words about this dream from Lawrence and Daria?
Yeah, thanks, Livia. I think the term came about because there were problems before, right? It looks like maybe things were not so evidence-based. So in order to renew our commitment to doing things the right way, we started calling it evidence-based research, so that it is clear that this is what we are going for. And it's an ideal target which we haven't yet reached. And as David said, when we reach that target, we can stop calling it evidence-based research, because all research will be by default evidence-based. Thanks.
Thanks. Daria, anything about the ideal? About I have a dream?
I don't have anything to add, unfortunately.
Sure, no problem. So we are aware of time, so we're shortly coming to the end of our panel, but we will take 2 more questions that came from the audience. So there was a question for all panelists. I will copy it to everyone. The question said, in the end, meta-research should be evidence-based research. Do you have any evidence on how well meta-research studies are justified or evidence-based? So David, maybe any thoughts on this?
Yes, it seems to be a difficult question. I need to read it once again. Do you have any evidence on how well meta-research studies are justified evidence-based? No, not really. I mean, it is. I mean, keeping the concept of evidence-based research in mind, it's necessary to provide justification or a rationale for each study one is going to conduct. This is true for all clinical studies, for all case reports, and of course also for all research or methodological studies, or all meta research that is out there. And also, if we think of discussing your own study results and to putting it into context with other studies, what is another core concept of evidence-based research. This should also be done in all meta-research studies, of course, and it should be done in all studies. I mean, in that sense, meta-research is not different from other research, and I think it is obvious that the idea of evidence-based research, this is what we dream of, that this should be present in all research that is ongoing.
Thank you, David. So we will have the last question of today to cover, and I will copy it to everyone. Since meta-research is often critical of researchers, what are thoughts around access to data in meta-research? For example, journal editors asking for specific references, names of researchers being criticized. So I can here offer first some personal thoughts of mine. So I think we should hold meta-research to the same standards as all the other types of studies, and I think the idea of open science should be promoted, and that it would be highly valuable if all researchers should also publish raw data that they have collected throughout their studies. So this would be ideal, and perhaps this can be easier achievable in meta-research studies compared to clinical studies where authors, the trialists, often complain that if they share data openly, that they may breach some confidentiality of patients, etc. So I would welcome this, and I know that as the comment says that journal editors can ask for specific references or names of researchers being criticized. So this is also often the case that when you are describing the studies that you have analyzed, that you should provide the list of included studies, so that it is clear which studies you have analyzed for transparency. I think this should also be a standard, and I don't think that this should be a naming and shaming exercise, but like collaborative efforts to improve research further. So, for example, in the study that Dawid and I have conducted regarding this meta-epidemiological definition, what is a meta-epidemiological studies? We have explicitly mentioned one study that I have co-authored, which was labeled meta-epidemiological. So we wrote, we have did the same thing. Some of the authors of this study have also used the term meta-epidemiological study, perhaps not in the adequate context. So this is not about naming and shaming somebody, but to come up with a consensus and ideas about how to make research better. So let's see maybe comments from Lawrence on this topic.
Thanks, Livia. I think once the paper is published, the authors take responsibility for the contents of the paper. And if we think there are concerns with the paper, there's nothing wrong with citing and saying, well, this paper had these concerns and this paper had these concerns. And this is not unique to methodological studies. In systematic reviews, we categorize studies by high risk of bias and low risk of bias. It's not naming and shaming, it's just the certainty of the evidence, right? We need to clarify that. Previously, sometimes the certainty of the evidence will be compromised simply because the investigators do not have the resources to do fancy randomization techniques or to follow up participants for 1 year and all of those things. And it's not that they're bad researchers per se, it is just that they were in circumstances where they could not conduct the research optimally. So I don't think it's necessarily a bad thing. And I am open to naming people and to be named.
Thank you, Lawrence, for your openness. Daria, any words on this?
I agree with Lawrence, and also because since methodological studies are presenting a summary of the overall picture, as long as we're, still discussing the results in the context of the overall body of literature on that specific methodological topic, as opposed to specifically pointing fingers at certain authors, I think that is not unique, and I think that is our duty in synthesizing the evidence and looking at these studies and determining what is maybe inappropriate or what are the issues in this in a specific topic in relation to the methods.
And thank you, Daria. And Dawid, maybe a few final words on the question.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with all three of you. I think we need to be fully transparent, and when conducting a methodological study, say assessing the quality of systematic reviews, we need to provide full data and be transparent. So we need to provide the data in such a way that the readers will be able to identify each single review in the data provided. So this data would also be accessible to editors and many others if they were interested in it. However, I do not know whether these data would be used by editors, or how could this could be done. This reminds me of a German colleague who said once to me, well, I know, and many of us know, that there is many research reports are out there who are of very low methodological quality, but what can we do about it? I would be, so this was his suggestion. I would really like to write a comment 3 times a day at least and send it to the editor of the journal. But I mean, if you're going to do this, you do not have any time left for your own research. So I'm not able to present a solution for this, but I really think that this is an interesting topic. How can we make the data that we are collecting in many research studies, well, maybe there are possibilities and ways to make these data even more useful.
Thank you, David. So with the wise words of David, we have come to close to the end of our session. Many thanks to everyone. Thanks again to our panelists, Lawrence, Daria, and David. Also many thanks to Matthias and Hans, who have supported the sending of the questions from the audience. And many thanks to everyone who has joined us today. Thank you for very active discussion, for all your comments. Don't leave, stay tuned. Now we're having a break, but see you all after the break at 4 p.m. Thank you again, everyone. It was a wonderful discussion.
Thank you.